All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to OT Office Hours. Thanks for joining us again. I'm Sam Becker, the Director of Marketing here at Insane Cyber. At Insane Cyber, we're focused on combining host and network data analysis for a full picture of cybersecurity to detect, secure, and maintain resilience among an evolving threat landscape. For today, we're going to be talking about something that's obviously near and dear to our hearts here at Insane Cyber. We're going to talk about bringing together host and network data so that you can get that full picture of your cybersecurity. So feel free throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, submit them through the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to leave some time at the end to answer those. You can also submit them through the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan and John to get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Starting out with an intro on myself, Dan Gunter, CEO and founder. Been in the space a little bit, was previously with one of the other passive network monitoring startups. Before that was with Air Force. Done OT through a mix of government and time, and excited y'all are here. It's good to see some familiar names. And it's good to see some good new names in there too. So, John, over to you for a quick intro.
Yeah, I'm John Guptill, the Director of Managed and Professional Services here at Insane Cyber. Before this, I was at another OT detection company, and then before that, I was also in the Air Force, working in the space of both OT and in offensive cyber operations.
Perfect. Next slide, please, Sam. So today, what we're going to talk through is challenges in OT, and how why it's important for both host and network data. So we're going to start out with some challenges. Some of these challenges might not be new to you, but when it comes down to details of like, hey, I'm really comfortable doing network because I can just buy a product and put it in. Well, what are you missing on that, right? Or hey, maybe we've actually run into people that have been stronger on the host side. They're either paying the big Splunk bill or they're paying the big Seam bill, and they actually do better. We see a few asset owners that are doing better on the host data side. It's like diet and exercise, right? You can't outwork a bad diet. And likewise, like you could do all the exercise in the world. If you don't have that right balance between like diet and exercise, your health kind of struggles there. So it's very much kind of the same thing, pulling an analogy coming in. So starting with some of the challenges. So like limited visibility and team capacity, right? Like calling out of the gate, why a lot of folks either go to the pure network or pure host side is they only have so many analysts. Their team's only so big. They're only so talented in a given area. Um, and also on that visibility side, what's interesting though, when you do that is that, you're either cost constrained on where you can actually monitor in the network. So, hey, am I monitoring between L2 and L3 and L3 and L4? Well, if you just monitor between, you might miss traffic between engineering workstations and PLCs and other devices on there, right? If that data doesn't pass that boundary regularly, you might miss that, right? So, limited visibility and team capacity when you go for one. This is again, right? Because teams are limited. You only have so much time and resources to put out. Um, Legacy systems and insecure protocols, same deal. You see outdated protocols, you see proprietary. There's always been this big debate on, do you encrypt? Is it better to encrypt and have integrity, or is it better to leave it open to where passive network monitoring can see it? Definitely a play. And again, location matters there. And to that side, like network and host only monitoring on its own isn't really enough, right? Again, it's an easy solution, but you run into cases where you're like, hey, either my network or host solution only, it's good at raising the red flag. And then I have to pay an incident response retainer a lot of money to come in and manually do kind of that human piecing together of what's going on. Without that host data, it can be really hard to correlate down to what the actual source of the threat is. John, what do you think? Where did I miss?
I think you hit it pretty well on the dot as far as the capacity of individuals, especially when you're having multiple sites and even locations. It's good for a place where you can gather all this information as well as from different things like You can't just rely on the network data. You need to get it from different layers as well as individually to the host as well. That's extremely important when you're trying to get a full picture of what's on your network and what threats are going against your network.
Awesome. Next slide, please. And John, I'll let you lead out on this one. You've dealt with both host and network data. So walk us through like what is considered host data, what's network, when do I need it, what do I get out of it?
Yeah, so within your network, so you have your host data. These are your individual devices that you're going to have on inside your network. This is your Windows machines, your HMIs, your controllers, all these different devices that you're going to try and figure out. But you want to get this information like the software, firmware from those devices on your Windows devices and your Linux devices, your installed applications, security settings, device logs, and even with some switches and firewalls about different network configurations about what's passing through those as well. And so you're going to want this individual data, and you want to aggregate that with your network data, which is sometimes what's passively going over the data, what's collected from the individual items. But as Dan said before, you need to be able to confidently capture this from the different layers, making sure that you're getting controller data as well as getting your data higher up with your other your Windows machines or other things within in the network, so you can get the bigger picture of bringing everything together. Within network data, it does get a little more intricate, where within the network data, you want the transaction records because on your PLCs, if they're set into their regular operating mode or running mode, they're just going to be talking what's needed. They're not going to be sending across um, information about the assets. They're not going to send out their firmware information or what they are in their normal run mode. And so, with working with network data specifically, you're going to want to query those devices or get those during a maintenance mode, or in the case where that's you're unable to find a maintenance window to be able to pull that information. That's when the host data is going to be most important in this, is pulling that information together in a time when you're not in a maintenance mode. Did I miss anything on that, Dan?
I would say too, another good, like what you can do is you break down like, hey, is going the route of host and network data kind of worth the time? A good way is kind of starting with a hard problem you have. And so one popular one we still even see today is asset ID. You
Mhm.
can generate asset ID, right? And if we look at network-based asset ID solutions in the OT field, there's really like three classes, right? There's the ones that are passively looking at network traffic. Again, you have to see the right packet with the right asset ID field come across at the right time. Sometimes that's
Hmm.
when engineering workstations are open. Sometimes that's when other traffic is going on. And so when that traffic comes really depends on, again, where you sit in the network and just how those applications work.
Hmm.
We've been actually involved in maintenance windows and turnaround in maintenance windows, and especially when vendors are doing maintenance, sometimes you actually get even better asset ID. Like if you're doing turbine maintenance, and if they're really manipulating that turbine, sometimes you get really good asset ID from the network side, right?
Hmm.
Where again, if you're not on the right switch or if you're not in the right area, getting it that way is challenging. So there are solutions that can probe. We also can probe certain protocols if an app owner chooses to do it. That sounds like your Modbus, like give me your identity, the Ethernet IP. It's generally one protocol. It can be sent to a device or sent via broadcast. It's how the HMIs and PLCs and everything else, and even some of the software responds to that. And then third way, like you'll see ways that are parsing it out of like config files out of firmware, out of EDS and other files that go across the network. SCL, substation configuration language. If you see those across the wire, sometimes you actually can get even deeper configuration on what's going on. But again, like, there's that network side. What's cool when you bring in host is it's like, okay, maybe you're strong because you have the right variables there. Well, when I go into host, hey, cool, I can go into the registry, into the uninstall keys, and see the applications and versions and windows that are registered right on those endpoints. I can go into even in the event logs and the application logs, like Emerson, Honeywell, a few others write to the application logs, right? So
Hmm.
even in a context of asset ID, like when you look at your specific one, again, you could choose asset ID. You could even say like, hey, what do I need network and host data for, finding this threat or like living on the land, right? If you were going to that living on the land side, well, you may see it on the wire, or you may need from Windows event logs or the PowerShell logs, those command lines to be like, okay, wait, I saw the network traffic. It looked kind of bad, but how do I find that smoking gun? And often, right, that leads you down to, the command line in the Windows event logs. So, John, I know I added a bunch there. Any thoughts?
Oh no, and I think that's great. And also understand that there are some assets that are going to be on the network that may never actually tell you what they are. They will never chirp their asset data. And
Right.
so that's where host data is very important to be able to add that in to strengthen your view. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes what's fun too is different protocols will give you different perspectives. So like I have a Schneider M580 sitting on my desk here. Some Schneider PLCs, if you ask for Modbus, the identity, the firmware version will be different than if you ask via UMass or the Ethernet IP one. So the other kind of fun to this on sometimes like getting more data, network and host together can actually build better asset ID. Because like there's certain fields in Modbus that have to be reported, but by the Modbus spec, not all of those fields are always right over the wire. And so, yeah, network and host data. We're getting a little ahead, but this is just getting into some of the fun of the value of when you bring this data together. So, Sam,
Oh
next
yeah.
time. Cool. So I'll kick this one off. What are the best practices? Why are they inefficient currently, right? So right now, the analyst is generally completely responsible, right? If you have a tool that is just passive network monitoring and you have a tool that's just a SIEM, somewhere you have to have humans that are combining and correlating that data, right? And it's both the issue of how much ground do you have to cover, especially to that resource constraint side, but do you also know what you're looking at, right? Do you know how Honeywell uses Common Experion, right? Do you know how Emerson Ovation under the hood is kind of kicking things around, right? So, today when we look at the industry, like the correlation between network and host is largely tied on that analyst. And that's where it like raises the bar on the importance of that analyst being both specialized and having a huge amount of knowledge.
Mhm.
Because of this, there's high risk of analyst overload, right? You can only process so much data. I think in the IT world, I'd be curious what this is in the OT world. In the IT world, I think Trend or someone put out a report that was like SOC analysts are like ignoring like 60 to 70% of data just because they're overwhelmed, right? OT, I would imagine it would be worse because generally there's fewer OT cyber people to more plants. And so if they're not deep in the data, it can be challenging for that. On that, the cost of doing nothing right is more production downtime. The investigation can only move at human speed to where if you start to push more of this into more of an automation pipeline to look at this, you can move a little faster. Humans make mistakes. No one's perfect. And so there's that also increased chance of risk and oversight. And sometimes the logs in the seam aren't enough, right? Like sometimes what you're getting is enough in the seam, but oftentimes you need to go below log level data. John, what do you think?
No, I agree that a lot of this goes on like analyst overload and like where are they going to be pulling this information from? How in depth are they going to be? Because yeah, with OT information, you're going to have things that are more remote, like you're going to have substations and other locations that like you may not have insight in normally with where your seam is being pulling logs from. So yeah, no, I completely agree with there's so much stuff going in there. If you're not doing anything that you're gonna miss if you're not looking at it. And you have to look at both sides, both the host and the network data.
Awesome. Next slide, Sam. How about John, you kick us off on this? I know we hit some of this earlier, but talk us through this. Why does it matter to bring them together?
Yeah, we were kind of jumping ahead on this one a couple slides ago with bringing them together where you have to you have your network data where it gives you like you can either take network data from a history through like a PCAP that was taken when an incident occurred or some period of time, or taking your live traffic. It gives you insight into like your live traffic patterns or anomalies that you may not be able to see directly on the host when you're looking at it. And also with the host data, that you're going to get more information that you won't see with a single networked data source. Like you're going to get, if you're able to get in there, you get your process execution, file changes, user activity, different logs or different tools that may be able to be dumping information from the host. Um, each of those have their individual strengths, but by bringing them both together, you're able to um, by putting those two together, it means you're able to lower your downtime costs with being like, hey, what exactly was it that caused this incident to happen? Like you can dig in and be like, hey, I've got network data and I can go then trace that and be like, okay, these were the hosts that were effective. Then you can switch jumping straight from your network data into your host. So like you can jump from one to the other. With having those across the network, you also are able to do your proactive threat detection. You can identify indicators of compromise on both sides. There are IOCs that live on the network side, like, hey, um, this flag was set across for one of my assets on the network. Hey, or on the host. Hey, this file that shouldn't have been accessed was accessed. You're also able to get faster instant response if both of those tools or information is being brought to you in a single source. You can then rapidly pull those together. And then, like I said before in the previous example, where you're able to correlate either jumping from your network data or your host information and saying like, hey, I see an indicator on one, jumping to the other, it improves your forensic investigation. You're able to actually get a timeline of event of like, hey, I saw this event on this host at this time. Then there was network traffic, and then I was able to jump over to this other host that I saw was also affected. And so you're able to get a better forensic visibility of your network. So yeah, did I miss anything on that one, Dan, or
No,
anything you
I
want to
think you
cover?
hit it or hit it well. The thing I would say too is that like the combination of data, like this isn't something that's per se optional, like especially when you enter an incident response scenario, it's very hard to do incident response with just one class of data. There's certainly cases to where you might be able to do it, but like I would say a majority of IR cases are going to
Hmm.
involve, some blending, right? So really the decision on bringing it together is like, hey, do you blend a little more earlier in the process, or again, do you cost of doing nothing is just you pay a little more towards the end on
Hmm.
someone else blending data on the fly. So yeah. Sam, next slide. How we approach on this, and this will be the only one to where we hit kind of how our product does it in, is that side of we do have plugins that we have network data processor we can batch and stream data in. And then to that point of command lines we were saying earlier, we have host data analysis plugins that do parse the event log and registry. The other big thing to think of and where we kind of strengthen the ability for analysts to respond is if you ever taken like the SANS forensics course or others, one of the first things you do is learn to build a timeline, right? And
Hmm.
there's so much value from a threat hunting or IR perspective to be like, hey, I see this weird DNS request. Let me like, pull some hosts in the area I think is impacted and see if I can get down, right? To some weirdness in the host data. And so, how we practically do it is pulling in network data, pulling in host data. We've supported other file formats. The team pushes through on that to regularly try to bring more in and get it on that same dashboard, right? To the point of bringing down time to where you're not, moving data from across Excel spreadsheets or running bespoke tools trying to kind of bring it into one area.
Hmm.
And last thing I'll say before I kick over to John on there is that like to the point of like some people are like, well, would my SIEM have enough of the data? Again, when you're like deep in, certain threat hunts or IR cases, you often go below what most seams store, because some seams, right, they have licensing to where you can only index so much, or you get paid to index or paid to search. A lot of times when you're building these timelines, you want like more of that time to be able to explore what's going on. John, thoughts there?
Yeah, and again, it was going back to when you're doing the incident response and pulling these two together into our product, where you can have your timelines. You may not be able to have all of the assets that you think that you need at the moment, but you can pull in information, like you can pull in information as you get it. So you can, as you identify hosts, you can then add the individual host data to add it to bring it into your environment and be able to build out that dashboard or look over through and trace your uh, or keep a good timeline or a good record of what's going on in your incident response engagement.
Awesome. Sam, next slide. I think we're on questions now.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A function or chat. I do have a couple that were submitted beforehand, but one that came through in the chat just before this, before we get too far away from what you were talking about with the product. Somebody did ask, what level is it possible to go down that you can collect host data in the tool that you were talking about, the Valkyrie, obviously?
Yeah, so right now, a lot of our depth is down into parts of the Windows event logs, specific fields. We had a case recently where, the team was iterating and had to parse together a few event logs and, do some unbase 64, another encoding, correlating down. And so right now, a lot of our depth on the host side is going down into, just depth of Windows event logs, and specific threat focused on there are things like a Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, things like that. Living on the land at that point, again, it's hard to see on the wire because it can blend with regular network traffic. And we see big wins, honestly, around, again, exposing out those command lines, digging deeper into, hey, does this call look normal for this type of, environment, or is this something that should be looked at? Again, same to registry. And so we're dealing with kind of core artifacts now. We do have some, one-offs that we've either worked with other groups on, dealing with data from, like switching infrastructure, other things like that. But a lot of the wins we're seeing today are still in kind of the core forensics post logs. That said, I'm sure, the team will keep digging in other areas. John, you have anything else to add on that?
I think specifically on the tool set for our host side. So yeah.
Okay, we've got another kind of detailed question in the chat or in the Q&A here. So what details are collected about operational processes that are used in context of potential impacts slash events, e.g. DNP3, SELFM, et cetera, challenges in correlation when time are not synced over OT slash IT, SIEM, firewalls, relays, RTUs?
John, do you want to start on that from the level, and I'll finish it out?
Yeah, so we are able to with it, we're able to gather DMP3 and SELFM fields that are pulled out of the out of the traffic, and so we can pull that out, and then those will be brought up to be viewed. Yeah.
And there are certain fields we're going down into. So we do go into certain proprietary protocols like UMass for for EGD for the G side. We have some for the command protocol side, which isn't out in a lot of the public tools. As you get down into the network fields of some of those protocols, you do get into operational data. You do get into certain parts of that. So seeing like, hey, what's the operational state of the device based on, a field in EGD or in, like UMass on the Schneider side. Host side, again, we're working through that. That's where the application logs become key. A big challenge is that every vendor, so application logs are not standardized generally. The format is, but what they actually put in there is. And so, to the challenges of correlating when times aren't always synced over, sometimes you have to get in the window, and then it becomes a fun problem to where like we don't entirely pull the work off of the analyst. You try to get the analyst as far as you can, and then often you get it down right to the window you can work down. John, any other perspective on that? I mean, I think you've worked some cases probably where you were working down to a time window with either imprecise or missing time data.
Uh, Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Yeah, so challenges in correlating with time specifically. So sometimes the time's precise, sometimes the time's not actually synced, and sometimes there's no time at all, right? And so
Mhm.
when you're dealing with network and host, like what's your perspective on um, you know, how we can help and then just how we enable them to do it.
So yeah, I mean, there you can get in time with getting those different timestamps as you're like bringing in the PCAPs, you can figure out like what you're doing that happened in the past, and then you can do live traffic captures to get what's going on the wire, depending on when you need to go. But like the biggest difficulty is making sure that you have the information that you're capturing it when you need it. So yeah.
We've had cases too, or I've had cases I've worked in the past where like with beaconing, it wasn't beaconing on regular intervals. And so sometimes with beaconing, you can protect when the next beacon's coming in. Beacon, for those unaware, is like if you have malware or other things that regularly happen, you can kind of see the regular windows it goes on to predict if you see it next. Um, it gets challenging with OT is sometimes things aren't happening on those synchronous windows. And so like sometimes it does become a like, okay, when's the next window where the stars might align to, see this physical thing,
Mhm.
especially if it's not on the network or not visible by one of those means, right? Um,
Mhm.
to the operational side, we've even seen cases, or I've been called in on cases where they're like, hey, we think we're getting DOSed, and it was actually PLC's kind of end of life. And so they were all sending out like Modbus and other exceptions. It made it look like they were getting DOSed, but we ended up tracing it back to be like, hey, all the Modbus exceptions that are coming off are actually tied to, maintenance activity X. And so um, that's where OT incident response is fun because sometimes you have to like the operational state can vary in that context, can be another context that makes a difference.
Mhm. And I've
Yeah.
also been in like, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Where timing also means I've been in a case where we were brought in to look at a network um, for one reason or for just purely do an architecture review. And we were trying to figure out if devices were or what was on the network. And at the time, it wasn't supposed to be a maintenance window, but we did find that one asset was going through and constantly doing these identification queries from one workstation. We found out that a vendor had left the computer on the network in the maintenance mode when he wasn't supposed to for like a couple of weeks. So it was good for being able to identify the assets, but then it was also being like, hey, like we've identified this, go turn that off. You're not in a maintenance mode. So that's where timing also matters on that. Yeah.
And last thing I'll say on a fun area that also hits asset ID is that like if you're watching on the Ethernet network, and we see this a lot with Modbus, right? Because a lot of times Modbus networks we're on will have like serial to Ethernet converters, and then you have a bunch of serial devices on the other side. Um, like if you're collecting and you're looking at some of the right data going in and out, even though like it's not the best because you're just kind of baselining or you're looking off of the behaviors off of a serial to Ethernet converter, there's still ways you can kind of be like, okay, what's going on with that serial bus that I don't directly see. To asset ID, it's the same deal, right? To the M580 next to me that's sitting on this backplane. Um, you can often get down into pulling stuff off of certain embedded devices, off of like peripheral other cards plugged in here. And so you might not know what's going on slot 4, but sometimes the CPU or other things kick things out, right? And so to that time, like not everything's going to have an accurate time. but we at least try to report when we see it when it pops up. Um,
Another question just popped up in the chat here. Any opportunity or capabilities to pick up host context and events passively off the wire if the device is already sending syslog to another destination where it's not easily incorporated into the SIEM, e.g. some pure OT system that they wish no interconnected to the IT SIEM?
Yeah, great question. So we're adding more syslog soon. We passively see syslog today. And so if the syslog goes by, it'll actually be indexed in there. That's something we actively watch. To share a cool thing we saw in a plant somewhere in the world, they had a certain security product they had configured a certain way. And that default configuration for that security product sent actually like the process data in the clear over the wire. And so in an actual like OT plan environment, we actually were able to pick up things like running process information and other things like passively over the wire. So absolutely syslog, we would passively see it. There's syslog integrations we're also working on, but passively that drops in because yeah, syslog opens up a whole, fun area. Now syslog is fun, right? Because it goes back to like certain parts of the messaging is standardized, and then like our engineering team has to go in and be like, okay, hey, in this syslog message string, I know for this vendor it's normalized this way, and so we try to take some of that work off even um, of normalizing the data, but you'd see it today. John, what else I miss?
No,
Syslog's
I think
another you've done a lot with, I think.
yeah, no, I think you hit the question that had where it's basically like if someone else is using syslog, would we be able to pick it up? And you grabbed it just great.
Yeah, and it's the same. That's why like for asset ID, like some of the passive tools, we'll send out some of the passive tools have other passive tools have active libraries. And so if you have another tool sending out that, beacon or like the Ethernet IP identity packet, we'll passively see that, right? And so
Mhm.
we can generate it, but we can also kind of hijack or tail off of another product in the environment doing it.
So Dan, you made a comment earlier that host and network data isn't like optional. It's not optional to have one or the other. And we have a question kind of about what's the best way to kind of bring in a tool to do that without overhauling your entire system? Like, what do you think is the best approach to that?
Yeah, so and a lot of OT people on the line will correlate with this. Like it's a challenge because some sites like you're dealing with really bad latency, or you're dealing with like, hey, this site's off a cell modem, or this site's floating out in the water somewhere, right? Sometimes there are hard physics problems with how much you can actually pull over a line. And so there's times that sometimes you have to put things forward to actually catch the data if you need to catch, because right, you can't make up data you never collected. You can pre-process things in the past if you collect the right metadata off of it, but there's a lot you miss by not getting it right. And so um, to that point, some of it comes down to a bit of an engineering challenge on making sure, like, hey, yes, there's the right bandwidth, I can pull the right data, this isn't going to interrupt or overflow any of the other data flows. But with that, like we see asset owners in different spaces, like some are deep into pulling like sysmon data, which is extended Windows event logging type data that gets you a lot more. Some actually have it in a SIEM on the OT side, so not connected to the IT SIEM. It's mostly OT SIEM side. It's really, it's got to be a bit personalized site to site. Obviously, with us, benefit is we collect it on that flyway kit side. For some, that's super helpful for them. But John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean it's gonna be yeah, you can't just rely on just one because you like Dan said, like you're gonna need that information from the host data and the network data or vice versa if you only have host data, you're going to probably need the network data in order to correlate between. And the access to the individual sites, they may not even be connected to the other ones, like Dan was saying, like ships or like locomotive, or even like some substations, you may not have a connection directly to that substation right now with the network, or a network connection that you could get to or that you could write on normally. So you need to get that both sides of information and from these different locations where it's difficult to get.
Nice. Thank you. And then I have a question for you guys that's kind of a two-parter. So do you think that there have been any lessons learned on A, the industry level, and B, on your personal levels about integrating both host and network data over time?
Yeah, I would say for one, I mean, Volt Typhoon's a good example to where, in Volt Typhoon, right, PRC group, at least the US government saying it's PRC, attacker that staged maybe 5+ years in US critical infrastructure. Again, this is all according to Open USG publications. With that, it goes back to like living on the land strong, right? So there's some days where we're like, hey, in OT, like, we have these embedded systems with their unique protocols. And then like you see a report like that where it's like, okay, hey, they're just doing things that honestly a lot of IT attackers would hit to. And so on one front, I think like the seriousness of, some of that threat. Obviously, there was that Senate hearing a week or two back. Emma, Rob Joyce, and the third panelist did an awesome job. You know, talking through that different part. And, even in some of the testimony given, they talked about the importance of network and host data, right? So I think we're on the edge to where, we're starting to see threats where it matters a lot more, to where it's not just like, hey, I can just look at passive network and, be fine, right? Or hey, EDR, passive network plus EDR. There's still a lot of ways to kind of get past whatever antivirus, if you do have antivirus down in the environment, right? And so um, it's a hard problem. I think some of the learning is just coming through we're understanding, what threats look like today. And again, props on government and others for actually detailing out those reports, because those reports do take some effort for them to push out. John, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, with going on the threat. But it also kind of goes back towards like monitoring your own network that you have, where if you're looking over the network traffic, you see weird traffic coming from, or odd ports or traffic that you don't recognize coming from a device, and you recognize that over the network. If you have host data where you're saying like, hey, what processes or what different things are generating that traffic, you're able to immediately tie it forward and bring that back. I know it's kind of a generic use case, but I mean, there's cases where you're going in there like, hey, they're like this one port is chirping over something that's non-standard. But if you have that host data or the knowledge of the host, you can go back and say like, no, it's just that this normal OT protocol is just running over a non-standard port. And so that's probably one of the key things that I've seen the most when going into a network, being like, hey, what's this weird protocol? And basically querying the host or talking to the asset owners and being like, well, what's that? What's the purpose of it? Oh, it's normal. And just getting rid of those false positives.
One of the other cool things too to call out is we work with some of the consulting firms we're working with. They have different ways of doing things like OT assessments. And one of the things I always enjoy is, as we're kind of working through, and again, like there's some to where we mentioned we're plugin based, we can put plugins in. There's proprietary plugins that some of our consulting firms we're working with, we can write. And I always like, a cool thing on my job on vendor side is seeing like, okay, well, how are you doing assessments? Show me like what's important to you, right? And because you can take like professional services analyst, and whether you take them from Dragos or EY or, one of the other big shops out there, pick your consulting firm out there. The cool thing is like to do an OT assessment, almost all of the firms are like, yeah, we're going to go to this data here, or we like going to this data here and doing this. And so, it's kind of really cool seeing where people go. For
Mhm.
ICS Village at like DEF CON and CornCon and a few other conferences, we did tabletops with ICS Village, and it was really cool seeing how people respond because we never really know. We'll write scenarios where we're like, okay, do you go to host or network data first? And seeing people like be like, I'm gonna go to network data first, and we're like, okay, explain us, like, because that's rare. Like most people are like, I'm gonna go to passive network because that's what's most sold on the market, and we're like, okay, why'd you go there? Because there's no wrong answer. It's just funny to see sometimes, and it comes down to what they're trying to do. Is this an assessment? Is this IR? Is this threat hunting? It's data is helpful in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. As kind of a follow-up question to that, you were talking about the the Volt typhoons and kind of the hearings that have been happening around that. Do you see or do we know of any trends in regulatory changes that are happening where they're going to start requiring host and network monitoring to be a, a necessity for some of these industries?
So I'm John, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
Yeah, or go ahead, Dan.
Okay,
I
cool,
mean,
cool. So
I've been out of the regulatory space
so
for a
I'm
while.
not deep on so again, I'm not a regulatory lawyer. I know enough to hopefully not get a NERC fine in my annual NERC training on people we
Mhm.
have to do. NERC like regulations like that, there are like penalties for busting times on like reporting and data you have to keep. In certain other OT environments, EPA data, right? They're regulated from like EPA or other sites, right? And so records you have to keep. Definitely consult a lawyer on that. I'm not super aware of ones that specifically call out network versus host data today.
Mhm.
I'm sure there are some if we had like Patrick Miller, who's really good at regulations on the call, I'm sure Patrick would be like, it's this one, and this one. And that would be a good I'm gonna hit Patrick up after this. Like, hey, what is it? But again, to that, like where it hurts from like the perspective we're in of like the IR, if you're in an IR situation, is if you don't have that data or if the data is not ready for analysis, you're going to burn downtime on that. And if you've activated your IR retainer with someone, you're also going to be burning hours off of that retainer, right? So it can become like time and cost efficient from the cyber response side, but it also can be expensive from the what's the actual downtime time if downtime is involved in this incident.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, we don't have any more questions in the chat. Any final thoughts from you guys on host and network monitoring? Any final plugs you want to throw in?
I would just
No.
say, like, the whole entire thing we're talking about is like you can't just rely on your passive network data, or even just if you're like Dan said, when you meet someone who's an instant responder or going into something, like what is their flavor that they like to go, data they like to go to first. Like you can't just run host data, network data. You got to integrate both of them to get the full picture of what's going on in your network.
I would just say we're pretty passionate on this topic. So if you ever like want to bounce ideas or need help or want to chat more through this or see how we do it even, like
Mhm.
hit us up. We're open. Even if you're just asking questions, like that's perfectly fine. But this is an area like we're pretty passionate about because again, like how we accelerate IR, how we, for that painful side, how we dig deeper on a threat hunting side depends on getting better on this. And so, it is a big area that I think will push, OT security kind of a lot deeper and take us to the
Mhm.
next bar.
Yeah, for
So
sure. If I had $1 for every time we say host and network monitoring, I'd be a rich lady. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Our next OT office hours is going to be on insider threats. So feel free to join us in April. You can go ahead and register for that, and we will see you all next time. Thanks for joining.